So I'm starting to record this session now. And the reason why I included this session in this module is that the issue of misinformation, of fake news, has risen to prominence in recent years. And I think one big wake-up call, at least in the Western world, were American elections, when this problem of foreign interference has gained a lot of prominence, even if it's nothing new, and Western countries have been involved in interfering in elections in other countries, but the sheer kind of usage, the way to which technology has been used and harnessed, and the sheer usage of personal information for that purpose, that has been well, in many ways unprecedented. Another example closer to European home was certainly Russian involvement in Ukraine, and the kind of the spread of information or misinformation around that intervention. There are other examples that we can talk about. So Christian will kind of outline this notion of misinformation, of fake news in the European context, in the context of the European Union. So thank you, Christian, for joining us. This is a timely topic. This is an interesting topic. So yeah, let's get going.
Hi, thank you, Kamil. Thank you for this wonderful introduction, and it's a great pleasure to be there again with you to do this as a joint event. I think it was a great event that we had last year, and I'm really happy that we're doing this again this year. The topic could not be more topical, and I will outline a couple of the dimensions that Kamil was talking about, and I hope that we have a nice discussion at the end as well. But at the same time, I also realize that there's so much to discuss that there will be many topics that will be untouched today, because in fact this is a much bigger issue than you can possibly cram in 1 hour. You could probably easily cram that in the next 30 hours and we still wouldn't have finished everything. But I want to start by just maybe talking a little bit about the notion that exists here in terms of the EU and hybrid warfare, because misinformation and disinformation is of course only one dimension of hybrid warfare, and I just want to outline very briefly what the whole picture is, and then I will drill down into one specific area, which is of course something that I research on, in particular in terms of the refugee crisis and how that was being used for misinformation campaigns. But if we start by outlining what hybrid warfare is, well, hybrid is of course something that is in between two different species. Biologists talk about that in terms of animals or plants, but it's kind of like a war that is somewhat a war or somewhat in between something else. And of course a war, you know what that is. It's a hostile conflict between different states, belligerents, or whatever you may want to use there, that involves a certain amount of coercion in order to achieve your political objectives. Warfare in general is the act of engaging in war, and so as a result of that, if we take the whole topic of hybrid warfare, we're not only talking about misinformation. Misinformation is just one dimension of that. It can possibly also involve several other dimensions in terms of actual military conflict, like what we've seen also in Crimea and obviously also Eastern Ukraine and so on. Now, Hoffman in 2006, he wrote an important piece where he outlined the range of different modes of warfare here, including the conventional capabilities. Again, we've seen it with Crimea, irregular tactics, formation, terrorist acts, including indiscriminate violence, coercion, and criminal disorder. One of the examples that you could also bring if we're taking something outside of the European context is, of course, for instance, the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war. Now, in terms of what hybrid warfare is, it's a distinct form of a low-level conflict spanning the whole spectrum of the various capabilities. It includes an opaque merger of both conventional and unconventional warfare, conducted under a single central authority in the direction of a state and a state-like actor. It aims to achieve certain political objectives that would not be achievable with just conventional methods. It blends those conventional and unconventional warfares to enable the exploitation of adversaries' strategic and doctrinal weaknesses. It also maintains, and that is particularly important when we talk about the Russians, it maintains deniability and strategic surprise. Now, if we bring it back to European democracies, and there Kamil has already pointed out a number of different issues that we've had. Western democracies, we had the US presidential elections, of course. We had various European elections that were also influenced. Some people clearly suggested that the Brexit referendum was also influenced, and a variety of European elections that have been influenced over the last couple of years. In general, the challenge is the following. Well, firstly, it's twofold. We have a systemic and societal challenge, the transformation of the media and the informational ecosystem. Increasingly, we see a weakened role for the traditional gatekeepers to a public conversation. So what are those gatekeepers? They are the media, and of course the media in particular is the one that is being attacked primarily by the adversary. And we have a strategic threat from authoritarian adversaries like Russia and China that are attempting to undermine Western democracies from the inside through political warfare, and whose essence is that anything can be weaponized. And I will give you examples of what can be weaponized. There's an exploitation threshold of detection and response. So both aspects are different, but they eventually form part of the same political and complex reality. Now, if we talk about this challenge, the main challenge, of course, in Europe comes from Russia. Russia here and Russian influence operation in the West. But I'm saying the main challenge comes from Russia, while acknowledging there's equally also other challenges, such as, hybrid warfare that also the Chinese are operating with, and so on. So it isn't just Russia, but Russia is, of course, the country that is particularly important in a European context. If we go out in the world and we go into more Asian context, then obviously Russia wouldn't be necessarily then the main protagonist. It could be, well, China, for instance, or it could be other protagonists. But in a European context, what is particularly important is the propaganda warfare. Propaganda here that portrays Russia in a positive way, in the West in a negative way, and disinformation that is aimed not so much in terms of portrayal of a certain image, but that is meant to confuse a Western audience with certain false stories. Generally, those go together in academic writing and also in non-academic writing as called propaganda and disinformation, but in fact propaganda and disinformation are two separate aspects of a similar objective. Both of those activities have both elements. The purpose here is to weaponize information to suit particular political purposes. Now, if we want to look at what kind of means are being used, I mean, Russians, for instance, use media networks such as Russia Today or Sputnik News. I can give you also personal examples of having been interviewed by some of those media outlets. They look like your standard news network, and you've seen that Russia Today has become quite important also in a British context. You see more and more Russia Today's news. They run both normal news stories and those that have propaganda purposes. So not every news that is being presented on Russia Today is necessarily false news. Different news have different purposes. Russia Today can be quite brilliant at the same time, but also much more sophisticated than your traditional Soviet propaganda, where, in the former Soviet bloc, there were a lot of jokes that were being made about Radio Yerevan. I don't know whether any of you have heard any of those, but of course, propaganda that is too blunt and too direct is not effective. And of course, the way Sputnik News and Russia Today is being used is far more sophisticated than what has been used by the Soviet Union before the end of the Cold War. We also just saw the reporting of a former reporter of Russia Today in Germany who used to work for Russia Today in Germany, and there have been a number of stories just recently where he then explained in detail how he was being used in terms of the misinformation campaign, propaganda campaign. He was even used as a spy on finding out exactly where Alexei Navalny is in Berlin, and then reporting back to the Kremlin exactly where he was being held and how easy it was to get there, and providing information as to how approachable Navalny was. So there was a long kind of discussion about what he'd done exactly and how that works. Now, if we look in general what kind of influence operations they've run, we have a number of different Russian influence operations. For instance, what Kamil said earlier in terms of the web trolls that were trying to bring up fake news with regards to Hillary Clinton in several swing states. But in particular, one that's been used very strongly in Germany has been the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis that was spun in particular in order to push out Angela Merkel. And in fact, Angela Merkel is now leaving office in Germany this September. Not only due to the refugee crisis, but the refugee crisis was being spun in such a way to make it more likely that she would leave sooner rather than later. So as a response to that, the European Union and NATO have set up counter-disinformation offices, and a number of European countries like Denmark and Sweden have also agreed to cooperate to fight Russian propaganda. So increasingly you can talk about a certain transnational aspect of geopolitics, which includes this hybrid warfare, which includes also the weaponization of migration, where external actors are getting more and more involved in the construction of an issue, here in particular the securitization of refugees. Russia in particular has done that, but also other actors have done that in response to Russia's actions. Now I'll give you the example of the refugee crisis. A lot of people have been discussing how in 2015, is that really a crisis? Because there were, of course, large migration flows that had crossed the Mediterranean states, before. So in 2015, the crisis in the end, it didn't start in 2015. It started already earlier, because it started basically from when the Arab Spring started happening. Initially, there wasn't a clear EU strategy. There were splits amongst EU member states, some that put more emphasis on search and rescue operations, others that put more emphasis on strong borders and so on. But governments started becoming quite early on afraid of a number of populist parties in terms of possible gains for populist and far-right parties across different European countries, and we've seen that since. We've seen that in Germany, but we've seen that even more so in other countries like in Italy and so on. So the perception had been spun in such a way that the public opinion is overall not very sympathetic towards asylum seekers. Actually, at the beginning, that wasn't the case. At the beginning, there was a huge sympathy towards asylum seekers, and in fact, they were welcomed. I mean, there was the famous Angela Merkel's "Wir schaffen das," we will manage. But over time, a number of different stories have been constructed, and there's a number of different examples where the far-right ecosystem is being used in such a way to create fake news that are then amplified by those very organs of Russian propaganda. So an example that, for instance, that particular person gave, I told you about the journalist from Russia Today in Germany. An example that he gave was, for instance, he was being sent to Greece to report on the refugees. And he was being set up in a little village where they were filming what he thought was the mayor of that little village, who said, oh, all these terrorists have been coming from Turkey. They're here. They've poisoned our well. They've kind of created all this. They've created a security hazard and all sorts of stories. Now, subsequently, he found out that this person wasn't actually the mayor, firstly, and secondly, this person that he was speaking to and that he was being asked to interview and then shown on TV was in fact a Golden Dawn politician who was from the Greek far right, who was setting up the entire story. Nothing in that story was actually true, but he had filmed that and reported on it. And when he brought his knowledge to the attention of his editors that this is in fact a fake story, this isn't true, they told him to report it anyway. They told him specifically that he's meant to report that story, even in the knowledge that the story was not true, even in the knowledge that in fact it was set up deliberately for him. So you see the interplay between far-right actors that are acting on behalf of Moscow. You then have the interplay with the various propaganda organs, the kind of Russia Today, Sputnik News, and so on, that are then reporting what they know to be fake stories. So it's not that they gullibly kind of get into a story and they're just unfortunately misreporting. No, they know that the story is fake, but they construct it in such a way that it is then amplified. Another story that was done in Germany, for instance, was the story of a girl of Russian origin in Berlin that had disappeared and then was then presented by the Russian Foreign Ministry as having been attacked by a Syrian asylum seeker, and the German media did not want to report it. The German media was accused of keeping a lid on this story, not wanting to report it. And there's this story of this Russian girl. In fact, she's not Russian, but she was kind of German from a Russian background, who supposedly had been attacked. Now, it turned out later, after all the Russian media organs had already produced that story and had plastered the entire internet with that story, that in fact that girl had never been attacked, that in fact that girl had left home to visit some aunt or whatever, and they were misrepresenting the story in the full knowledge that it wasn't true. And it went as high as the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, who himself personally amplified that story. So this is not just a story at the lower level of the Russian echelon. This went up all the way to the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. So this story was meant to create a negative presentation of Angela Merkel's government. It was meant to undermine the German traditional media in the reporting of the refugee crisis, and it was entirely fabricated in a bid to construct refugees as a security issue, to make sure that they're being perceived as a, in a sense, as a security threat, that they're perceived as a terrorist. Now, what is the effect of that? So after the crisis, we're talking about 2017, 2018, the European Council for Foreign Relations did a survey, and in the then still 28, now without Britain, 27 EU countries, every single EU country except for Ireland accepted that migration is a security threat. Every single one. That is a huge change compared to the situation before the refugee crisis. We had a massive shift from a variety of different countries thinking that this is possible issue that we need to deal with, to thinking that there's a security threat and that there's in fact a terrorist dimension to it. So we have created a certain narrative of profound and radical transformation, and this narrative is then being used by the various actors inside the societies, the far right notably, to push their particular agenda and to gain importance in the political spectrum. And the far right in general are a wide variety of different actors. We have various actors, identitarian actors, differing in terms of ideology, identitarian, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT, anti-Semitic, white supremacist, a whole range of different spectrums. But what we also need to be aware that the actors that are acting behalf of Moscow are not only far-right actors, but they're also far-left actors. So for instance, in the German spectrum, we have the direct clientist parties of Moscow is the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right party, as well as Die Linke, the left party, that is also propagating almost one-to-one the kind of discourse as it is written in Moscow. In addition to that, we also have a number of parties, a number of politicians from your more respectable parties, from your more centrist parties that are also being bought now. And in a German example, I can give you the most famous one, obviously the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who is on the payroll of Vladimir Putin. He's now, I hope I'm not saying the wrong one, but he's the chairman of the Nord Stream, the gas company that was set up between Germany. And in addition to that, he's not the only person of German nationality who's sitting in that board. He's sitting there together with another German, whose name I've forgotten, but whose background I found particularly interesting, because that other German who's also sitting on the board with Gerhard Schröder has a background as a former senior Stasi officer in East Germany. So we see that Moscow is also using the pre-existing intelligence networks from its time as a superpower in Eastern Europe, and they're doing that obviously in Eastern Germany, they're doing it in Germany, but they're using that also in a variety of different Eastern European countries. It's very clear to see in Hungary, for instance. Hungary has already become a clientist state of Moscow. We're seeing that in a number of other Eastern European countries, where the old intelligence networks that used to exist are now being used for similar purposes on behalf of Moscow. Now, this is called, if we want to bring it back to the Russian terminology, I hope I'm not mispronouncing it too badly, but it's hybridnaya vojna, the hybrid war. There's a variety of different theorists. I'm not going to go through all of them in terms of what exactly it is that they're doing, but the idea is here targeting the spirit of the enemy public, defeating the enemy's active institutions. So it's important to deconstruct institutions, seizing the destruction of objects of psychological value, and creation of impression of order to obtain certain allies. And we're seeing that quite a lot. If we're going around various European countries, we're seeing a variety of different allies, from the Front National in France that received credit statements for credit from Russian banks so that they could finance the French presidential campaigns of Marine Le Pen when she ran against President Emmanuel Macron. We see that with the Lega in Italy, that are using some of the gas companies and the gas supplies to Italy in order to finance indirectly their political activities in Italy. We see that, as I mentioned, in Germany. We see that in Britain. I don't want to point the finger too much at Britain, but of course we see that when it comes to the Aaron Banks in particular, the person who was bankrolling UKIP and who was also bankrolling a number of the Leave campaign, who was also financed by Moscow. A lot of his personal wealth that he supposedly donated to the campaign was coming from Moscow. And we see that in a number of different organizations that are using in this particular way. Now, the idea here is breaking the spirit of the adversary nation by gradual erosion of its culture, values, and self-esteem, using political and information and economic propaganda tools rather than military force. That does not mean that military force cannot be used. When we look at Ukraine, for instance, we see that military force has been used. But when we look at Western Europe and even other countries in Eastern Europe, we don't necessarily see military force. Corrupting and undermining your adversary internally to achieve political goals that are based then on information warfare. There's a variety of different toolkits that the Russians are using from multi-level and often country-specific. So whichever country that we're dealing with, their pre-existing networks, their tools are being used in a slightly different way, very effective and difficult to combat. Using proxies, like I mentioned, a number of proxy parties, privately contracted forces to influence various conflicts. attempted assassinations. We have obviously Skripal, we have various kind of poisonings that again are nothing new, because of course that happened very much under the Soviet Union as well. But of course, during the time post-Cold War, many people had forgotten the kind of tools that the KGB used to use, and in fact the GIU and the FSB continue to use until today. We have cyber attacks, infiltration of critical infrastructure, manipulation of gas pipelines, electric grids, financial systems, interference in election campaigns, influencing outcomes towards candidates that are more favorable towards Russia, towards candidates that are more favorable to stop sanctions, for instance, against Russia, economic sanctions, financing anti-European parties to promote Russian narratives, investing in strategic sectors in foreign countries to maximize dependency on Russia, and orchestration of various widespread disinformation campaigns that are meant to show a certain image. Now, what's the kind of image and what's the kind of hook that Russians are particularly using? That's the kind of idea of the Russian moral conservatism. It's basically using Russia as an inspiration to traditional values and using Russia as the power that stands behind those traditional values. We see the success that we've seen already in a number of European countries. Marine Le Pen, for instance, mentions Putin shares common values, which are the values of European civilization, in particular, in quote, Christian heritage. The Hungarian party Jobbik, Europe should get back to its own roots and rearrange its relationship with other traditional cultures that only exist in the East now. So there's a certain insistence that Russia is special. It has a particular, in a sense, moral duty to bring Christianity to those other countries, which in a sense, you've seen that discourse throughout Russian history. So again, it's an old pre-existing discourse. Also, the leader of Italian Forza Nuova, for instance, Moscow is the third Rome. Again, reproducing identically the Russian discourse. Moscow is the third Rome, and the role of Russia in history is to revive Christianity. It has also worked to an extent in the United States. When we look at the Republican Party, Patrick Buchanan, for instance, he mentioned, in the cultural war for the future of mankind, Russia is planting Russia's flag firmly on the side of traditional Christianity. Christianity here meaning linking up with anti-LGBT activists, American Family Association, declaring that Russia is on the side of those people who oppose, in quotes, gay propaganda, using that also as a tool to hook certain ideas that stand in opposition, as it's put, to kind of Western European moral decay. We also have the Frente Nazionale in Italy that supports Putin personally as a courageous politician against a powerful gay lobby, quote, and a number of different campaigns where then in election campaigns Putin is also used personally as in order to gain. In the UK, for instance, we have Nigel Farage, who I'm sure you're aware of, who made a comment that Putin is the world leader that he most admired. If you poke the Russian bear with a stick, he will respond. It's one of the statements that he made. EU leaders in comparison are weak and vain. In Austria, far-right politician Heinz Christian Strache, he called Putin a pure democrat with an authoritarian style. We see that all of this had a very, very strong impact. The EU started developing different activities in terms of developing a center on hybrid warfare, developing a counter disinformation center. But in general, the challenge is the following. There's often a lack of understanding what the Russians are doing, lack of a common threat perception. Different European countries perceive this differently. So, for instance, bringing up in Germany the idea that Gerhard Schröder is a lobbyist of Moscow is a much more complicated matter, because of course you first need to raise awareness of this existence. It's not that people don't know that he isn't close to Russia, but they don't see it in that particular way, that he's necessarily a lobbyist for Moscow. So the threat perception is not necessarily the same across the different European countries. We have a lack of an integrated analytical capability. We don't have European capabilities that are very strong in terms of actually pushing for countering this. We also, well, there's a certain hesitation also to really plan for this. And I think here, in order to plan for hybrid warfare, you need to be first aware of your national vulnerabilities. And vulnerabilities are often something that countries don't necessarily want to discuss, that they don't want to necessarily plan with, sometimes because they don't want adversaries to even find out about it. But oftentimes the adversaries are perfectly aware of those vulnerabilities, and it's more a case that they don't want to look weak in the eyes of their own population, which means that discussing those vulnerabilities in order to counter the abuse of those vulnerabilities is often difficult. We also have limited effectiveness of counter-hybrid efforts, lack of sufficient resources. The unit in the EU that deals with countering misinformation is relatively small. We're dealing with a relatively small outlet. If you look at the resources that Russia is putting into creating the misinformation, you're probably seeing a ratio of 100 to 1, roughly, in terms of budget. And it's not because the EU could not afford, but it's because there isn't a clear awareness in terms of how much it needs to do in order to counter that type of propaganda. So what can you do? Well, there's something in terms of creating more of a framework to deal with hybrid security threats, forging, and here that's the most important one perhaps, forging common in-depth understanding in terms of what that means, articulating strategic goals, adapting more proactive campaign approaches, and also building parameters that support those joint actions. So I'll stop at this point so that we can also discuss and that we have a couple of questions. I think it would be a shame if we don't have enough time for that. So I'll stop at this point and I'll be looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Christian. I will hand it over to our students to ask questions. But first, I just wanted to kind of make very few, very brief comments and maybe ask a question or two myself very quickly. So when you commented on the American scene and you made a comment about this Republican politician who spoke favorably about Russia, I think that really puts the American politics on its head, doesn't it? Republicans speaking favorably about Russia as some kind of conservative role model, whereas Democrats being highly critical, right? That's completely the opposite of the John McCain tradition of American kind of Republican Party, right? As you were speaking about Russia today, one thing that popped to my mind was how widely they covered Occupy Wall Street movement. They like, I even read an article about it, that this was a story that they were going on like every day for hours. Like this was this huge crisis of capitalism in America. And interestingly, when I was doing my PhD, I was renting a room, and the house was owned by an older guy. He was originally from Scotland. He was around 60 years old, a good guy, but he watched Russia Today every day, and we talked about it quite often. And the way he was explaining this to me was that essentially he felt that Russia Today covered issues that the BBC would not touch, and he liked that. He liked getting those kind of other points of view as he would get it, but it went to the point that he didn't watch anything else. On the question of Germany, I'm just wondering whether Angela Merkel is an exception rather than the rule, and whether Gerhard Schroeder isn't actually the rule, because the Eastern German upbringing of Angela Merkel seems to me that it gives her this kind of unique perspective that is not that widely shared in Germany on the question of Russia. Germany seems to me has always been either naive or at least kind of, somehow sympathetic towards Russia, not really seeing countries like Belarus and Ukraine, or just kind of, pretending that maybe they are not there prior to Angela Merkel. So I'm just wondering, I'm not saying whether it's a good or a bad thing, but I'm just wondering whether Angela Merkel's tough stance on Russia isn't an exception. And finally, on the question of EU capabilities, I'm just wondering, the one of the first article I published and the one that we published together was on EU climate security, and we talked about policy entrepreneur in that paper. I'm just wondering whether, as I was doing interviews in Brussels, it occurred to me that climate change has become a security problem in the European Union because there was a small number of entrepreneurs, influential people in the Commission, in the Council General Secretariat. So nowadays, probably we talk about European External Action Service, who essentially pushed that agenda to the European level very strongly, right? And Javier Solana at that time was also interested in that issue. And Germany held presidency in 2007, I think, and it also was interested. So there was this momentum that was created, and it led to this kind of stronger recognition of the EU as a climate security problem. So I'm just wondering if what we need at the EU level is this kind of stronger policy entrepreneurship, the coalition of different forces to raise awareness in the first place, right? Because those are issues that we don't often, I guess, talk about or not enough, and whether that could actually help. So I'll stop here. You don't need to answer right now. Let's see if there are some questions. So there is a question from Libertas. How would you describe differences between Western and Eastern European countries regarding how they react to Russian disinformation? Is it the lack of historical experience with Russia that makes actors in the West more prone to that? Okay, so Kristen, back to you if you want to address any of those comments, and then we'll invite more students.
Great. I'll go through them one by one. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the Republicans. At the beginning, it is, in a sense, it is crazy to see that the Republican Party has become the pro-Russia party when it was the Republican Party that was very much warning of the danger of the Soviet Union at the time. In particular, it was initially maybe going a little bit far, a la McCarthy, but certainly being very, very aware of the issues in relation to Russia. But I think for that one needs to be aware that, of course, the kind of change that has occurred in Russia has made it possible to connect to the right of the political spectrum in a much, much better way, because Russia has shifted ideologically. I mean, it was nominally, of course, communist until the fall of the Soviet Union. Although even in the last couple of years, one can argue about how communist it really still was. But it certainly shifted in a way almost to an ultra-capitalist version of economic model that was then seemingly stopped by Vladimir Putin when he got into power, to kind of bring a bit more rules into what was then perceived as a cowboy capitalism. Now, what that means is there was a certain ideological vacuum in the Russian political scene, and that ideological vacuum was filled with the traditional Russian ideology that goes back to more traditional Russian thinking, which is about a strongly conservative, strongly conservative view of morality, anti-gays, and so on and so forth. And that has made it possible for it to connect on the outer fringes of conservative movements. It can connect to the Republican Party. It can connect to right-wing parties in Europe, and it has done in a number of ways, which has been always the weakness that the Soviet Union had. Because if you think about the Soviet Union in the during the Cold War, it was only ever connecting to the communist parties in Western Europe. It wasn't able to connect to any of the right-wing parties, and that has changed. Russia today, and I don't mean the media, I mean Russia as it is today, is able to connect to the political scene in Europe and in the West in a much better way than it used to be, because of the way in which it has transformed its own ideology in a more traditional way. And on top of that, we've seen tremendous amount of influence operations when it comes to the Republican Party. I mean, there were a number of spy rings that were notably found in the United States that were deliberately targeting the right wing of the Republican Party, and that were in the same way. In the UK, you have the conservative Friends for Russia. In Germany, you had the kind of what is it called? I've forgotten the name, but there's a similar kind of institution in Germany too. But the countries where they connect in a political spectrum that varies, because what you find is that, for instance, in the US and in Britain, they can connect partially to the more right-wing fringes, although in Britain, it has to be said, there's also connection to the Labour Party in particular. There were connections also to Seamus Milne, the advisor of former leader Jeremy Corbyn, so there were connections there too. That is the old Soviet connection that used to be there because of the socialist dimension. But in addition to the old Soviet connections that pre-existed modern Russia, there's also the new connections that were being built, and they were more built with the right and the far right in particular. So Russia has managed to expand the connections on the political scene. Now, when it comes to Russia today, I think you're absolutely right. I think there was the Wall Street movement that you've been talking about. There were other incidences. There's evidence of Russian infiltration of the Gilets jaunes movement in France, for instance. There were Russian infiltrators that were actively trying to make the situation there more violent in order to cover it in a particular way, in order to weaken President Emmanuel Macron. There's lots of evidence in terms of the anti-COVID restriction movements in Germany, where they've been clearly infiltrated by Russia. And you're right to point out that, in a sense, Angela Merkel, to an extent, is an exception in terms of the German political spectrum in terms of being so tough, because the German experience with Russia was, of course, one where Russia provided their approval towards German reunification, and as a result of that, Russia gained a lot of credit within the German political spectrum, right? Helmut Kohl, for instance, the former German chancellor, he was not a pro-Russian politician initially. He was actually a politician who was very much anti-Gorbachev. He didn't trust Gorbachev. It was partially Maggie Thatcher who convinced him that Gorbachev is somebody that you can do business with. And over time, this was something that was then proved to be right. But in Germany, you always had the social democratic tradition of opening towards Russia, of change through engagement is kind of the slogan that Willy Brandt, the former German chancellor, had. And there was this idea: the more you engage with Russia, the more you're going to change Russia. Now it appears that the more you engage with Russia, the more you change yourself. There may be that particular dimension. So I think Angela Merkel managed to understand that perhaps better, and that's probably also why she got more into the firing line than some other politicians did. You certainly see that there's the traditional Gerhard Schröder types, but of course there's far more direct ambassadors for Russia in the German political spectrum now than there ever has been before, because in the past there used to be the left party that obviously always has been very pro-Russia, but now you also have the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party that is also now there on the spectrum. You have similar things also in Austria, in Italy, in France, and so on. So in terms of a European approach, the problem is, like you said, there's a policy entrepreneur missing, in that there isn't sufficient, perhaps, understanding of the threat that is being posed. I think occasionally you see some politicians who understand and accept it. Angela Merkel was one of them. I think Emmanuel Macron, for a while, looked like he might understand it, although he's made far more pro-Russian noises more recently. We see a number of other politicians. Now, when it comes to West and East, I think it's important to look at each actor in turn. What we find is that there's actually not so much of a difference between Western and Eastern European countries in terms of how the Russians act, because the Russians, they had their networks both in West Germany and in Western Europe and also in Eastern Europe. the pre-existing communist intelligence network that existed and that exists in all Eastern European countries today, that exists also in Western European countries today, including Britain. Even Britain had a number of scandals where spy rings were, famous Cambridge spy ring. Obviously, there were a number of other kind of famous events that happened also in Britain. Those existed in the past. Now, it is true that in Western Europe, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was certain complacency. There was this idea that Russia is going to become a friend. There was even a British cabinet discussion that was discussing seriously whether Russia could become a NATO member state. So there was a certain time period under President Yeltsin where there was this idea that Russia could become part of the West. That time period passed, certainly with President Putin, although even President Putin at the time, if you remember his first few years in office, he made a lot of noises to the extent to see Russia anchored in the West, although he started to distance himself over time from that idea. Perhaps, like the Russians said, that they were rebuffed. Maybe they were never genuine to begin with. I don't know what the answer to that is for sure, but certainly what we see is that there's a variety of different manifestations of this. We look at Hungary, for instance. Hungary is an Eastern European country that has a lot of negative experience with Russia. There was the kind of military takeover of Russia when Budapest was invaded. So a lot of negative experience that hasn't stopped the current Hungarian government to completely direct its foreign policy towards Moscow. The current Hungarian government is dependent on Moscow. It is directing its intelligence capability towards Moscow and is acting as an adversary of the West. In a number of reports, various intelligence agencies in the West have talked about Hungary as an adversary of the West, even while it is an EU member state and is supposedly a friend and cooperation partner, but has the behavior of an adversary. Even if we look at Poland, for instance, Poland is a traditional anti-Russian country, if you like, right? Poland has a lot of people that have anti-Russian ideas, and yet there's people that use a certain anti-Russian discourse to hide their own preference for Russia. There is people that are paid by Russia and are people like Gerhard Schröder. It's just that they need to do it in a slightly different way. They need to be more careful in terms of their overt support for Russia, and they need to use their influence in a more discreet manner than maybe you can do that in Germany, for instance, where it is possible to be more overtly pro-Russia than perhaps it is in Poland. But Poland is really the example, is really the exception there, because those strong, maybe the Baltic states as well, where there's an overt anti-Russian sentiment that you have to be careful about. And even in the Baltic countries, you have a lot of Russian influence operations as well. So you cannot imagine that it doesn't happen there too. But then you have other Eastern European countries like Hungary, where there's a total overtness in the admiration for Russia. So in a way that you don't have anywhere in Western Europe, in a way that you have it in Hungary. But at the same time, you have those politicians in Western Europe too. You have them in Italy with Salvini and the Lega. You have it in France with the Front National and Marine Le Pen. You have it in Britain with Nigel Farage. So those politicians exist everywhere, but it depends on the national context, how far they can go in terms of their overtness, in terms of their admiration for Vladimir Putin, and in terms of their support. I think in certain national contexts they have to be a bit more careful what they say, but that doesn't mean they don't exist in all contexts. I mean, East and West, those influence operations exist.
Thank you, Christian. Do you guys have any other questions? You can speak on the microphone or type them in the chat box. We still have a few minutes to answer any questions. As someone may be possibly typing, one thing I'll just say is about Poland and Russia. I think you're right with your comments and your assessment. And one interesting indirect way to gauge the Polish kind of attitudes towards Russia is when you look at its attitudes towards Ukraine. The previous government was much more sympathetic towards Ukraine and kind of the advocate of Ukraine, kind of getting closer to Europe. Whereas the right-wing government, which has been in power for many years now, they've cooled down those relations. They much more emphasize the nationalistic character of Ukraine. They have those outlets, media outlets that run stories about fascists in Ukraine, etc. Yeah, so they are not pro-Russian in any direct way, but the way they speak about Ukraine tells you volumes about where the sympathies are and how they are shifting. Because it clearly contrasts with the tradition of the Poland's kind of pro-Ukrainian kind of advocacy on the European scene. Do you say you had personal experience with Russia today? Was this an interview? If so, what was the experience like, Christian?
Yes, so it wasn't Russia Today, it was Sputnik News. That's the radio station, and in fact that was just before the refugee crisis. I was being interviewed, and I was meant to give my assessment as an expert on both counterterrorism and also on refugees. I was meant to give my assessment of the refugee streams, but unlike other media experience that I've had, where usually you're being asked to just comment a question and just give your assessment as you give it, there was a clear attempt, and you can still find, if you look at Sputnik News and my name, you can still find the interview online. There was an attempt to get me to say that those refugees are likely to be terrorists. There were many leading questions put in my mouth to suggest, to achieve that I would have said the refugees are likely to be terrorists. I obviously did not say that. They didn't manage to get me to say that, and I was subsequently no longer asked about that question, especially at the height of the refugee crisis. But I could sense in a much stronger way than I've ever sensed in any other kind of media interview, and I've a lot of media experience with a lot of different media stations, that they were trying to get me to say something that they knew I wouldn't want to say. And they still tried to get me to say it nonetheless. And that's what started my interest to find out how the refugee crisis was being misused, because I thought this is odd. And that's when I started digging in terms of, well, why were they trying to get me to say that? I wanted to know more, and that, in the end, you then get to the truth a little bit more, because you can actually find out a lot of that information online.
Just to kind of quickly comment, as you were speaking, I typed Sputnik in my inbox because I was approached by Sputnik for an interview. I declined, and your kind of comment here reinforces my feeling that it was the right decision. What they wanted to talk to me about back in 2017 is the growing gap and the kind of disagreements and even conflict between Poland and the European Commission. Right, this was the time of those kind of stark disagreements. They really wanted to get into details on how far Poland and the European Commission are moving away from each other. Yeah, so. Yeah. But yeah, no. So that you can see, I think it's the similar pattern of showing how the EU is breaking its unity and kind of running those kinds of stories. Would you say that the refugee crisis in 2015 was the tipping point for Brexit?
I wouldn't quite say that. I think the refugee crisis was being misused in the referendum campaign. There's no doubt about that. And we have those posters, if you remember the Leave campaign posters of the massive refugee flow that were then used to say we have to get out, otherwise those people are coming here. Obviously, none of that was true, or in fact, even possible in any shape or form. So there was an attempt of misusing the refugee crisis. There's no doubt about that. But I think the Brexit campaign had many different dimensions, not only the refugee crisis. It had, in particular, the way the whole debate had been structured. I mean, from what we can see is that initially when UKIP was started, it was already being financed in all likelihood by Russian financial sources already from the early 1990s onwards. So this has been a long operation that Russia had run in the United Kingdom with the ultimate objective. I'm not sure that they knew that it was necessarily going to be Brexit that they wanted to achieve, but they wanted to have an influence operation within the British political spectrum. And by using UKIP and Nigel Farage, they obviously managed to push the Tory party in a direction that the Tory party initially would have been very, very uncomfortable with. And as a result of that, I would say that there's been a long operation with this. I would say at least 20 years operations that the Russians were running in the United Kingdom. But this should not surprise us, because a lot of the Russian intelligence operation are sometimes 20, 30, 40 years in terms of time period. It is not something unusual that they would have done a 20-year operation in Britain. It is something, I mean, if you look at Gerhard Schröder and his kind of, that has been a very long-running operation by the Russians as well. So this is not too surprising, but this is how the KGB used to operate, and this is what the Russians have done since.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Christian. I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Actually, we run out of time. This is, it shows how interesting this topic is, because there's so many aspects of it to talk about, right? And some of them we haven't even touched upon. But well, thank you very much, Christian. This has really been great. This has really been great. Thank you for this. You gave a really great overview.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure, and I'll be happy to do this again soon.
Oh yes. I'll certainly be in touch about that. Thank you, Christian, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for your questions, and I'll see you guys on Friday. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. Or do I leave actually?